Throughout history, African Americans and other people of color have suffered tremendous racial inequality in America. There have been countless efforts to improve civil rights for people of color. However, these attempts were not good enough and caused many frustrations with the movement as a whole. The efforts to gaining equality for the blacks was a slow-moving process that angered the minority, and de facto segregation was one of the key frustrations for them. De facto segregation is racial segregation that happens by fact, rather than by legal requirement. It has nothing to do with the law, so the white authorities were enforcing this social expectation of segregation upon the black community simply because of prejudice. Although some laws had been passed to help end segregation, activists were frustrated with the slow rate at which these laws were being enforced. Segregation still existed in restaurants, schools, stores, and many other places throughout the society of the 1960s. A way in which many activists displayed their growing frustration was through riots. A famous example of these riots were the Harlem Riots of 1964. These riots began on July 16, 1964, when a police officer killed a young black boy in Harlem, New York, and lasted for 6 days. CORE scheduled a peaceful march to protest against police brutality 2 days after the event, but shortly after the march, a group of more aggressive and militant activists brought the protests all the way to the police precinct. A number of fights broke out between the protesters and the police, and by the time the riot was over, 16 black demonstrators had been arrested. The Watts riot, one of the most famous riots of the 60s, occurred the following year in Los Angeles. While arresting a black man for drunk driving, the police used excessive force, which caused a small group of people to gather around the scene. The situation remained peaceful until a police officer accused one of the black women standing nearby of spitting on him and moved to arrest her. At this point, the crowd erupted and began throwing rocks and bottles at passing cars and buses. The crowd's reaction caused the police officers to call for additional support, and when they arrived, the violence and fighting only intensified. Thinking that their presence only exasperated the issue, police officers left the scene. With the police presence gone, the protesters took to the streets, overturning cars, smashing store windows, and looting them. This riot lasted for 5 days and left 34 dead, 1,032 injured, nearly 4,000 arrested, and almost $40 million worth of property destroyed. Black activists were getting restless, and the riots and protests only continued to grow in number. In 1968, a report was commissioned and formally known as the Kerner Report. It concluded that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The report delivered an indictment of white society for isolating and neglecting African Americans and urged legislation to promote racial integration and to enrich slums, primarily through the creation of jobs, job training programs, and decent housing. However, President Johnson rejected this proposal. In April of 1968, 1 month after the release and rejection of the Kerner Report, rioting broke out in more than 100 cities across the nation following the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Before he was assassinated, however, Martin Luther King Jr. was involved in a northern campaign in Chicago. The objective of this campaign was to expand civil rights activities from southern to northern cities. This campaign was different than previous campaigns of King's because the segregation in the North was far less extensive than its counterpart in the South. Because there was less segregation, it was harder to make the issue clear. Martin Luther King Jr.'s goal was to use nonviolent methods to address the complex economic exploitation of African Americans in the North. However, the city of Chicago posed a challenge due to their hostility towards the march. During the march, bottles and bricks were thrown at the nonviolent protesters, and King himself was struck by a rock. The citizens of Chicago as a whole were unwelcoming and completely hostile towards the protesters. This was the attitude of many whites during the 1960s. Civil rights activists, whether they were nonviolent like Martin Luther King Jr. or aggressive and militant like Malcolm X, were frustrated with the lack of effort that was put in to enforce desegregation laws. Many blacks still faced all kinds of segregation and prejudice in their daily lives with little done to help them. All throughout the 60s, protests and riots brought attention to both the problem of segregation and the frustrations of the African American community about the slow rate at which the desegregation laws were being enforced.